Hi, we'll get started in just a moment. I noticed that the attendees are just starting to log on, so just give it just a couple more minutes. Okay. Hi, everybody. I want to welcome you to National RTAP's webinar on Demystifying Trip Planner Licensing Agreements. My name is Nancy Doherty, and I'm an analyst with National RTAP. It is our goal that this webinar provides you with a clear understanding of the contents of these agreements, what you're agreeing to, and what, if any, are the risks to your agency. But let's first start with a few housekeeping slides on how to use and participate in the Zoom webinar. I'm sure most of you are pretty familiar, but just in case. For audio, you can use your computer or you can use one of the numbers shown on the screen. You will need to enter the ID shown here if you do call in. That number is 981-243-35597. Please use the chat box here if you have any problems. You need help using Zoom during the webinar or to communicate with other attendees. Use the Q&A to submit questions to be answered probably at the end of the webinar. I'll jump in if I think the question I need to interrupt the panelists, but I prefer to have the questions answered at the end of the webinar. And also, the webinar slides and recording of the webinar will be posted on our website in about a week from today. So for over 6 years, National RTAP has offered tools and technical assistance for creating and updating trip planning data. And through these years, we have found that often a planner within an agency has their trip data ready to go, but a higher level agency staff person will not click through and agree to the terms of the agreement, which is necessary before the data can be consumed by the trip planning app. We have found the standard legal terms of the trip planner licensing agreements can be a barrier to trip planning. It's scary, let's face it, it's scary for a small rural or tribal agency to do business with a large company, for example, Google. Agencies are uncertain if there might be penalties when not performing in accordance with the agreement. If there's a dispute, where would it be handled? Has there been litigation or penalties around GTFS data? Our goal today is to address those concerns. So here's our agenda. First, for those of you who may not be familiar with National RTAP, I will give a brief overview of our program and then introduce our speakers. Our first speaker will give you a brief introduction to general transit fees specifications, more commonly known as GTFS, and what the standardized and digitized data are used for. She will briefly discuss the process for uploading GTFS to trip planners. We will not detail today how GTF data are created or managed, or we would discuss GTFS Flex. Both of these are really large topics beyond the scope of this webinar. I would suggest that you check out the National RTAP website for GTFS training resources and our GTFS Builder Toolkit. The toolkit consists of 2 Excel spreadsheets that work together, and if you're familiar with Excel or willing to use Google Earth to obtain your stop location coordinates, it's a pretty easy lift. If you're interested in a future webinar on either GTFS Builder or GTFS Flex, please let us know in the chat box. After that, our legal review will be led by Monica Kaiser, who will discuss transit agreements using the Google Transit Agreement as an example. We will discuss existing litigation involving Google Transit Agreement. Spoiler alert, Google Transit staff that we reached out to and our attorney panelists are not aware of any litigation that has occurred since 2007. And then lastly, we will hear from a forward-thinking agency in Pennsylvania who developed their GTFS in-house with GTFS Builder and navigated and signed the Google agreement. Their services are now discoverable on trip planners, and you will have a better understanding the many ways of how standardized GTFS data makes reporting easier. And at that point, after that, we will open up the webinar to questions. So for those of you for whom this is your first National RTAP webinar, National RTAP is a technical assistance program under the FDA, or the Federal Transit Administration. Our mission is to address the training and technical assistant needs of rural and tribal transit operators across the country and to support state RTAP programs. Our resources are provided for free to state RTAP programs and to 53 subrecipients. These resources include transit applications, toolkits, training modules, and webinars on many topics. And when life is more normal, we travel around the country to transit conferences and present these materials. The program is managed through the Neponset Valley Transportation Management Association, and we are located outside the city of Boston with an office in DC as well. We are guided by a review board consisting of both transit and state RTAP managers. They can provide feedback on our products and ensure that we provide relevant materials to the people that we serve. So if you haven't been on our website, nationalrtap.org, I would encourage you to do so. And please contact us if you have any questions or need assistance. We have an amazing resource center staffed by a dedicated librarian who will find you the information you require no matter what it takes. So we'll put you in contact with someone that can help you. So at this point, I would like to introduce our three speakers. First, Marcy Jaffe supports and guides rural, tribal, and intercity transit partners with technical assistance related to the General Transit Feed Specification, GTFS, and National RTAP's GTFS Builder. GTFS Builder is a simple Excel tool that is used to generate GTFS data for online trip planning at Google Transit, Apple Maps, Bing Maps, and others. Marcy has worked at the Washington DOT, or State Department of Transportation, as well as the San Francisco Regional Planning Agency, known as the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. And we'd like to tell you that in 2016, the balance of Maryland's statewide digitized transit network was built on GTFS Builder with Marcy's assistance. Tim Phoenix, who was supposed to join us as our attorney panelist, was not able to join us today. However, we are very fortunate that his colleague, Monica Kaiser, another attorney with Hopeful, Phoenix, Bromley, and Romans, has stepped up and will be joining us. A practicing New Hampshire attorney for the last 20 years, Monica's current practice is focused on civil litigation, real estate, land use, and other transactional matters. For many years as a criminal defense litigator and mental health counselor have allowed her to hone her skills in negotiation, persuasion, and the art of distilling complex information for consumption by regular people, which is one of the reasons that we invited her to join us today. She will explain the provisions of a sample transit agreement and offer practical tips for agencies entering into contractual relationships with app developers. Chelsea Youngs is a data analyst at the Crawford Area Transportation Authority in Pennsylvania. Chelsea has been with KATA, as it's more commonly known, since February 2019 in the planning department. Some of the projects she has worked on include creating and maintaining your agency's GTFS feed on Google Maps and other trip planners, setting up a fleet inventory system, and launching a new driver log app called Artsy Fleet. She is passionate about her community and is currently serving as president of the Meadville AM Rotary Club. That's cool, Chelsea. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree in mathematics from Westminster College. So at this point, I'd like to welcome Marcy to begin her presentation.
Thank you, Nancy, and welcome to all of you who are taking time out of a crazy pandemic world that we're in to move your agencies forward with the concepts of GTFS. So what is a general transit feed specification? Who in your agency might be the right person or persons to work on that data? Where is that data published? And what kinds of applications might be using the data once you do publish it? Why should an agency move forward? So let's just review a little bit of who in your agency might be best. We have found that there's a specialist often who knows operations, might know where the bus stops are. They could put together the schedule, and we'll show you what the schedule workbook looks like. And then you might have someone else who likes the mapping and some other eccentric details about the colors of the routes. So you may be able to partner in your agency, one or two people, to work together. And as you'll find out in this conversation today, we publish this kind of data in multiple formats. We have Move It and Transit App and Avail and Route Match. All kinds of tools are now showing information that you could also find at Google Maps, Apple Maps, and Bing. So why would you develop your data? Next slide, please. For those of you who haven't seen it, and I'm still surprised because we've had over a dozen years working on this, but Apple Maps is one consumer of the data. And if you were going to make this 150-mile trip and you didn't have a car or wanted to just enjoy the ride, this is what it would look like. You'd know where to pick up the bus, where your transfers are, some of the bus stops along the way. And another visual on this GTFS data, next slide, from Google will explain to you maybe there are multiple routes that get you a portion of the trip, and then you would get on a green route or something else. So there are details that you can find through all of your mapping apps available to your phone or to the computer as shown here. And you even find out that this trip would be a total of $2 if you were to take it with the subsidies that are available or free transit right now. What a deal to go, 5 hours for a few dollars. Next slide. So what would the data look like? How hard would it be to gather and organize this data? We have 2 Excel spreadsheets. We're not going to detail them, but if any of you have seen a schedule, possibly your own schedule in Excel, we wanted you to have the capacity to map or organize in a similar way. And all we need are the stops in stop order, top to bottom. If you don't know the time at a particular stop, you'd enter an asterisk. If you want to fill in the time, you can, but the tool will interpolate or calculate those intermediate times. So just a quick scan. How complicated is the data? Not too. Thank you. Next slide. We have in our toolkit and at National RTAP, for those of you who are interested in more of the training tools, you prepare or create a cloud account with National RTAP and you go into GTFS Builder, and then you can access and download this toolkit. It comes as a zipped file. You need to unzip it, not just click on it. Don't let it be too smart for you. Extract the file will help you with all of these steps if there are a little too many details. But the other piece of the puzzle is that some agencies along the way said, I don't want Apple, Bing, whoever, whatever, coming to my website to pick up the data. Could National RTAP offer hosting of the data? And yes, we can. So that's the lower part. Thank you, Nancy. That's another free service from National RTAP to take away another barrier. Let's continue our conversation. Next slide. What does our toolkit support center look like? We've made very teeny tiny 1 to 3 minute videos. So if there's one task, like how do I fill in the agency tab that's shown at the bottom of this slide, you wouldn't have to watch a 2-hour video to find out the 2 minutes you need. They're very brief, hopefully to the point. They're in YouTube and allow you to access information. But we also have technical support. So we won't leave you hanging, watching a video, getting confused. Join us and we are here to support your success. Next slide. So a very quick scan of what it might take. We suggest that you prepare at least one route, and you'll hear from Monica maybe why you want to do that. One route before you begin the agreement process. You don't have to solve every detail of that route, but just have one valid route. And then when there's a request to have that uploaded within 14 days, you'll be good to go. The agreement process is a back and forth conversation, and Chelsea will help explain what her experience was. And during that time, you'll be able to prepare some additional routes and stop details. And then you go into a test environment. And during that test environment, we often go, oh, I never saw our data in this way. Oh, I don't remember that bus stop works across from that bus stop as a different way of transferring rather than going to the hub. If that data doesn't work for you, you can explore with Google or whoever you're testing with to say, I want a correction, and make those corrections before it goes live with the public. We might say the timeline is about 4 months if everything is good to go. We don't want to focus only on Google, but they have the more formal, as you'll see in that first row, the more formal agreement with formal agreement terms. And they are likely to publish your data. Nothing is guaranteed in this world, but we wanted to give you a feel for who is saying, yes, we'll take your data, and who might need a little more of a nudge. And often we hear that an agency wants to jump into real-time information because it's available and riders need this, but you cannot get to GTFS real-time or publish your real-time at Google Maps without having the static scheduled service available. Apple Bing, Move It, all have agreement processes. Sometimes it's as simple as a brief email that said, are you willing and interested to publish your data with us and keep it up to date, 2 to 5 sentences. The Transit app, when I discussed it with them, said, we'd really like to show that real-time information along with the scheduled data, and then we'll be good to go. They also said they'd like 1 million trips, and I said, that's not who we serve, but we nudged them a little bit, and they said that they would work with us because their secret sauce is in the real-time information. So when you're ready with that, it's a opportunity to move forward. National RTAP does not take a role when it comes to real-time information. We do not offer a free service for real-time information. We're just queuing you up so that as the data is ready, you'll have what you need on the static or the scheduled service. I think, Nancy, that might be giving us a chance to speak with Monica next.
Yeah, thank you, Marcy. Great job.
Yeah.
At this point, Monica will begin her presentation on trip planner licensing agreements.
Thank you very much, Nancy. And thank you, Marcy. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah,
okay, great. So I never knew, frankly, as a consumer and user of Google Maps, frankly, how much went into inputting the information. As I review this information and see what Marcy has laid out, I, along with some of you, might be thinking, well, this sounds like a good idea. This sounds like something I want my agency to do. But is it right for my agency? And so I'm here to help you sort of with the analysis of that decision. As Nancy said in her introduction, there is a little trepidation, a little fear about entering into agreements, particularly maybe with big entities like Google, if you're a very small transit agency in a rural area. So we wanted to reassure you in the first instance that this agreement, while it is a couple pages long, it's about 4 pages long. It's not really rocket science, and it's not a multi-million-dollar agreement that you have to really stress about. We have not found any litigation on it. And I think that is in part because it's an agreement that doesn't involve a lot of money, that doesn't involve a lot of heavy obligations or financial obligations. I think that's also because there's really not an incentive to litigate on either side. For example, if you're the small company, you're probably not likely to take on Google, even if you disagree with something that they may have done. There's a lot of costs involved in litigating against a big company. And you may just say, well, you can imagine a situation where somebody says, but I want to participate and I want this service, so I'm not going to fight with them about the terms of their agreement. Similarly, Google, is a very, very large company, and they're not going to pick on little old you. If you're a small transit agency in a rural area, the cost of litigation for them, it doesn't get them anything. They want your data because they want to make their product user-friendly, so more people go to their website and use their app. So they're interested in getting as many partners as they can, and they're not going to waste their time fighting with the little guy because maybe that agency submitted their data 1 day late. I just don't see it as a realistic possibility. So that may be part of the reason why we're not seeing a lot of reported cases on these issues. You can go to the next slide. So hopefully that makes it that makes you breathe a sigh of relief in the first instance and think, okay, maybe this is something that we could do. We're a small company, but maybe this is a way that we can boost our ridership by making our data available. So anytime you would enter into any agreement with any vendor for anything, and you'd have to execute a contract, presumably you're thinking about some of these things on my list. You're thinking about what your business goals are, what the thing is that the vendor has that you want, whether it's widgets you want to purchase or marketing services you want to purchase, whatever it is, you're thinking about what your business goals are and how much you want the thing that's available to be purchased or the service that's available to be purchased. You should also be thinking about what kind of organization you are. Are you big? Are you small? Are you a private company? Are you a government company, a government agency? Are you a tribal entity? Because if you're a government or a tribal entity, you may have some additional boxes to check before you enter into a contract with another company. And then you're also thinking about, well, what do I get from entering into this partnership? What's in it for me? But also, what is it that my agency has to do? You know, what are the obligations? Whether it's how much money do we have to pay, which is usually the case, or like you have here, you're not paying anything, but you have obligations. What do I have to do? How do I have to get them my data? What format does it need to be in? You know, and what are my obligations to keep it updated? And is that something that we can do? Do we have staff who are able to collect that information and maintain that? And then you're thinking about potential confidentiality considerations. Probably not a big issue in this circumstance, but you may run into it sometimes if you're contracting with a vendor for software or any type of situation like that. That vendor may want you to keep the relationship confidential, or they may want you to keep the information that you learn about their product or service confidential. Google, for example, wants to maintain a certain level of confidentiality. You, on the other hand, probably aren't feeling very proprietary about your data. After all, it's simply your transit schedules. You want those pieces of information out there in the world. But in any event, so you're thinking about whether there are confidentiality considerations on your end or obligations you have to the other party. And then you're thinking about what your bargaining power is. And I'll make it very simple. You have very little bargaining power in this relationship with Google or with Apple or any of those. The agreements and the services that they're proposing are what they are. You're not likely to be able to get them to change the form of their agreement. The question is, again, it goes back to they may not really enforce certain provisions of their agreement and waste their time chasing after you, but you're not going to have any success getting them to change the language in their agreement, so don't bother trying. And then lastly, what's your tolerance for risk? So this seems to me to be a proposition, again, because you're not purchasing something for a lot of money. You're taking information that you already have, that you already own, and you're sharing it, but you're sharing it for the purpose of getting your information out there on the web to boost your ridership. And on the other side of that is your obligation. Okay, you know, I have an obligation to get my ducks in a row with my data and submit it. And then I have an obligation to keep it updated. So you're weighing those obligations against what you stand to gain from participating in this process. We can go to the next slide. So if any of you have ever seen a transit agreement like Google's and your eyes glazed over on the first page, I understand entirely. That still happens to me sometimes. But to just take you through the sample Google Transit agreement, it's like most contracts, okay? So what it does is it defines specific terms that are operative, that are relevant to the type of agreement that's reached. If it were an agreement for widgets, it might define what a widget is. Here, it's an agreement for the sharing of certain data. So it describes the data, and it describes it in one of two ways. It's either basic or enhanced content. it's either static data or real-time data. For our purposes, we're really just looking at the basic and the static data. I'm not going to get involved in the real-time stuff. Some contracts will also define what confidential information is. And it's usually information that's not out there in the world, available in some other format. For example, your trip schedules are not going to be confidential because they're out there in the world. But whatever secret thing Google does to put their information out there on the web, that might be confidential. And if you find out what it is in the course of your dealings with them, that's probably not something that you should be sharing. The next thing that a contract does is it identifies what each party's obligations are under the contract. And you always want to look at the way the contract is drafted to see if it's equal. I notice in the Google transit agreement, it's very clearly lays out certain obligations for the transit agency to provide information in a certain format and in a certain time frame. You keep reading, it doesn't really ever tell you at what point they're going to upload your data. And it doesn't seem to place those kinds of restrictions or time frame information and obligations on them. But you know, it is what it is. The next thing a contract usually does is it will tell you what it is that it isn't promising.
Sorry, I think we lost Monica for just a second. She'll be back in just a minute. Monica, if you can hear us, do you want to call in using one of the numbers at the beginning of the presentation?
Nancy, what if I make contact with Monica and we'll just be flexible? Our pandemic world has taught us a lot about flexibility. Chelsea may be good to go, and when Monica
That's a
could
good
join us
idea.
again. Okay.
Chelsea, would you be okay if we kind of jumped ahead to your presentation?
I'm ready.
All right. I think Monica is probably going to jump back in just a minute, but
We're on slide 20. Yeah.
yeah, thank you. Okay. So.
Okay, I'm Chelsea. I'm from KATA, and we service the Crawford and Venango counties in rural Northwest Pennsylvania.
Sorry, Monica. You're still muted.
I'm back.
She's back. Okay, we started with Chelsea, but we're gonna go back to slide 20, which is where we were.
Thank you.
No worries. There you go.
Still don't know why that happened. Okay. So I was saying one of the things that the contract does is it has a warranty section where you're basically promising that the information that you're giving them is, or more that you own your name, that you own your service mark, that you own essentially the information that you're giving them. And then the contract describes the length of it and how it is that you terminate the contract if you don't want to be in it anymore, or how Google would terminate it if they want to be in it, if they don't want to be in it anymore. And then there's usually some standard language about where the contract would be litigated if it were to be litigated and what law would apply, and some general things like where you would give notice of any changes that needed to be made for the contract, and that you can't change the contract unless you do it in writing. Those are the general elements of the contract. And they're often going to be in any kind of contract. It's just that certain elements will be a little bit different, but generally the framework is as I've put it out here. On the next slide, we'll consider the specific obligations in this contract. So you're promising to give the Google or the app or Apple, Bing, whoever it is, you're promising to give them your GTFS data and you're providing them with permission to copy it, distribute it, and create other work from it and display it. Not for all purposes, not so that they can run out and create another transit agency just like yours with your name and logo. You're only giving it to them for the purpose of this service that they are providing you. So you're giving them a license to use your name, your logo, your data, but you're giving it to them for the limited purpose of in connection with the product or service. And again, with respect to your company name, your trademark, your logo, etc., one of the things that you always want to do is make sure that you legally own that information and that it is yours to provide. So when I say that you're giving them that information only for the purpose of this product or this service, so that your logo gets up on Google at your bus stop, you're reserving all other rights you have to your name, your data, your service mark, your trademark, all that sort of stuff. So it's really a very limited license you're giving them to use your specific thing for the reason you want them to use it, right? This is the whole ball of wax. This is the game right here, to get your information out there. And finally, as I said earlier, just agreeing to provide the data in a particular format and in a particular time frame, and you're promising to keep the data current. Both sides are agreeing to protect certain confidential information by only disclosing what's necessary to perform their contract obligations. One of the things that you agree to is that, and that I think Google agrees to as well, is that there'll be no public statement about the relationship between you and Google without prior written permission. Both parties agree by signing the contract. It says specifically that either side can terminate at any time with certain notice. And then the promises that I talked about and the limitations of liability that exist are also part of the contract. And then, the standard miscellaneous terms. So for your purposes, next slide, what are your risks and how do you resolve them? So in terms of a threshold issue is whether or not you have the authority to enter into an agreement, and who at your agency has the authority to enter into contracts. I expect you all know who that person is, but at a minimum, you want to make sure that if you are a government agency or if you are a tribal entity, there may be additional hoops you have to jump through in order to get authorization to enter into a contract with another company, particularly if you're a tribal entity. You've probably had to deal with those issues before and look at whether you need to go before the tribal council to get authority or what it is that you have to do. Presumably you have a tribal attorney that you work with and you can discuss those issues with them too. You have often some specific concerns about whether you've waived sovereign immunity by entering into other contracts. That's not a question that I can answer for you, but that's an issue that your tribal attorney has likely had to resolve for many other types of contracts. In terms of your trademark, your company name, you just need to make sure that you're a properly formed legal entity. You need to make sure that if you have a trademark or a specific logo, that it's up to date. If you have a logo that you want to protect, you might want to look at getting trademark protection before you just give permission. What if it accidentally belongs to somebody else and you never knew it, right? That's an issue that you would want to resolve before you put that logo out there into use on the internet. In terms of performance, that's all stuff that you can clean up ahead of time by just before you sign the contract, by thinking about how it is that you're going to collect the data that you need, who in your agency is going to be responsible for collecting it and putting it in the appropriate format and sending it to Google, and then who's going to be responsible for making sure that it is kept current and updated. How do you collect the data for our purposes with the static data that we're looking at? That's not complicated. You already have that information. But if you go into a situation where you participate in real-time data and you have certain software or equipment that you use to collect that data, you want to be thinking about your obligation to the provider of that software or that equipment to just make sure that you can then take the information you get from that and use it in another way. Again, for the static data, not a problem. Confidentiality should not be a problem. Again, your information, your trip schedules aren't confidential. To the extent that you gain confidential information in the course of dealing with Apple or Bing or somebody else, it's just a matter of making sure your employees dealing with those entities understand the obligations to maintain confidentiality. Some of you, if you read an agreement that talks about, like this agreement does, where certain litigation would occur, you know, there's usually a section that says, hey, this agreement is going to be litigated. If there's any litigation, it has to happen in California, and the law that gets applied is California law. That may make people very nervous. It's not likely a term that can be negotiated. And it's also, though, not likely to ever present a major problem with this specific agreement, right? For the reasons that I talked about at the outset. This is generally a low risk situation where you're providing information that you already have, uploading it for a limited purpose to meet your business goals, maybe of increasing ridership. Google is not likely to sue you. They know that you don't have a lot of money. There's nothing that they get from doing that. They really want to engage in this agreement so that they can get your data because it makes their product better. And you want to participate in the relationship because your service is improved the more people know about it. So generally speaking, courts, when they look at contracts that do get litigated and they examine these provisions that say, that mandate what type of law applies or what jurisdiction a contract has to be litigated in, most of the time the general rule is going to be, you know, the parties can agree to whatever they want. If someone wants to enter into a contract with me and they want the contract to be enforced by, you know, Montana law in Montana courts, I don't have to sign that agreement, but if I do, that provision is going to be upheld. Because generally speaking in this country, you can contract with anyone you want, free from government regulation. So unless there's something particularly unfair about a specific term like that, it is what it is. And as we go back to, you know, what terms can be negotiated, you're not likely to be able to change that portion of the agreement with Google or Apple. Now, it's possible if you have a working relationship with Google or Apple and you haven't gotten all your data ready, or you're a little bit late uploading some of it, that you may be able to say, look, we're not going to be able to provide this data in 14 days. We need 30 days. Maybe they'll work with you on that if they really want your information. But that's really the only thing that I see in this agreement that's likely to be flexible or able to be negotiated. My guess is all of the other pieces of the contract are what they are. And that brings me really to the last thing, is the last slide. Once you have all this information and you've looked at, you know, what do I need to do to get ready to participate in this agreement? What obligations do I have? What can I do to get my ducks in a row before I execute this agreement? Once you have all that information on one hand, and then on the other hand, you look at, you know, what do I get once I sign this agreement? What is the benefit to my agency? You weigh those two things out, and that's your business decision. And That's all I have. I'm happy to answer any questions now or at the end of the webinar.
That's great, Monica. That's just what we needed to hear. And we'll, if there's any questions, we'll answer them at the end of the webinar. So at this point, I'd like to invite Chelsea to share her experience with trip planning, and she will provide several excellent examples on why developing GTFS data is so important to riders and to the agency as a whole. Welcome, Chelsea.
Thank you. So I'm still Chelsea. So the GTFS feed was one of my very first projects when I first started. And it took me about 4 months from the time I first downloaded a training video on the National RTAP website until we were live. It was an overwhelming process at times, but it helped me learn how our transportation system worked. It helped me see where our strengths were. And during the second half of the data validation, it helped me see where we could improve. And I was in contact with Google about every day during this process, and I was making changes every day. But Marcy was a great resource throughout the whole thing. She answered any questions I had or directed me to where I could find them. And she's a great cheerleader, so if you need that, definitely email her. But once we got live in October, we had 11 of our routes up. And overall, it was a great experience for me, and I'm glad I was able to do it. Next slide, please. So after we were live, we didn't have a press release because you have to fill out a special form and submit it to Google to get their approval, and there are rules on their logo. So we just didn't worry about it. Instead, we took the trip planner widget from the National RTAP website builder and put it right on our site. And since November of 2019, when we did that, we've had 1,087 trips planned through that widget. And that's great because if you think about it, that's 1,000 less phone calls regarding trip planning that we had to take. But today we have all 22 of our routes up, and we have about 334 stops, sorry. Next slide. I know one concern was the confidentiality. However, we're an authority, so we're bound by the PA Open Records Law. And even though not all requests for information are granted, most of them are that are reasonable. But to further emphasize what Monica said, any information that we shared with Google was already on our website somewhere. Next slide. The GTFS project required us to be more consistent for our riders. During this data validation stage, we had to update our website, and now it's up to date with our new brochures. And we were able to format our brochures from both of the counties we run to have one consistent look. This is when we remove stops. This is where we added stops that we might have not referenced before. And this is where we renamed a lot of our stops. So a couple issues we had was we'd have the same stop on 2 different routes, but they were called different names. Or maybe a stop referenced a store or location that didn't exist anymore. So unless you were familiar with the area, you didn't have a good location of where these stops were. And after we went live, I fully expected to be done with this data, except for updates or new routes. But I was very wrong. Next slide. I use the GTFS shapes to put out notices for when there's a route change. We always ask for public comment. And before, we might have to ask one of our brochure designers to do this, but now I can do this in-house, and I just map it on Google Earth and it's ready to go. And next slide. When we update our brochures, now I can map it on Google Earth, and then I can export it to a KML file and send it directly to the brochure designer. This has saved us so much time because the designer has exact GPS locations of all of our stops. Next slide. Before, hopefully maybe we had a brochure already made and we can easily make changes, by hand to kind of tell them what we want. But a lot of times somebody would have to plan all of the stops in Google Maps, via directions, and you can only do so many stops. So, you have 5 or 6 different maps for one route. And that was confusing. And there's a lot of back and forth. It's like, no, this is exactly where I want it, not on that corner, and this is a huge time saver. And another big time saver for me is now that I can use Google Maps, I use it for my ADA checks. This is a door-to-door service for individuals that live on the fixed route traveling to another location on the fixed route that cannot use the fixed route bus based on disability. And the rule of thumb here is the shared ride cannot take longer than 2 times the fixed route length of time. So every month our trips get exported from Ecolane and some of them get checked. In this example, I pulled a trip from Ecolane and the shared ride trip took 20 minutes. I plugged in the start, I plugged in the end, and this person wanted to leave their house, about 10:30, and it gives me the best route. We have to take 2 buses and it's going to take 38 minutes. Done. Now, unfortunately, that's not how it always was. Prior to this, I had to put in a lot of more work to figure out what was the best route. Next slide. So KATA spans 2 counties. We go through about 9 towns. We have 22 routes, over 300 stops. There's a good chance that I'm not going to know the best route for somebody to take off the top of my head. So what I used to do is I would take the start point, and it was in Meadville, and they're also going somewhere else in Meadville. I knew where Walmart was, so that's good. And I knew it. We use our green route for that. But for the start location, I'd have to Google it. I'd pull up the maps, find out where it was. It was near the high school, so I knew it would use our blue route. And then I had to, figure out where the road was compared to our brochures, because it's such a small side street, it's not going to show up on a brochure. So, I figured out, okay, it's between Grant and Hillcrest. Next slide. I'd have to Google the closest bus stop to see, on what corner was the closest to this person's house, how long it would take for them to walk. And then I'd have to guess the time between where they got on the bus, where they got off, how long it takes to transfer, how long it takes to get to the end point. And after all that, it took 40 minutes for their trip. Now, and me figuring out, luckily for this trip, I knew where the end point was, but for a lot of them, I didn't know where either location was. So there's a lot of room for error in that, and it's just very time consuming. Next. Our operations and maintenance department actually has use for my data as well. So they do quarterly checks, just because where we are, they need to check the general wear and tear of our signs, make sure they're still up. So whenever they do that, they come to me and I pull my schedule worksheet and I print them off a copy. And this is helpful to them because before they would just take a brochure, and our brochure only had listed out all of our time stops, not all of our untimed stops. And furthermore, a lot of our untimed stops weren't documented properly. So they have all this list ready to go. They go through it, make notes, and they're able to pass it on to anybody that needs to make repairs. A cool example with this is last time they did this, they had an issue with stop number 47. It's supposed to be on North Main and Henry Street. And as they're going through, they realized that sign's on Sherman Street. Next slide. So they pulled up their location on Google Maps and they were able to look that the sign is actually supposed to be on Henry Street. So that was exciting for me that they got to use that. And then also the GTFS Shapes is a great planning visual tool. One example we just did is we had our green route. We had to make some adjustments because we're having a bike share program start in spring of 2021. We're going to have a bike rack on a brewery in town. So we needed to use Bessemer Street. We had one route that went to Bessemer Street, but only on request. So we had to figure out, without having to rewrite everything, what's the best way to do this. Next slide. So we pulled up our red route too, that runs kind of close to that. And we looked to see, you know, what's the best plan of action. Next slide. And we were able to, you know, kind of see, we could reuse some of the red route stops for our green route and not have to hang up a lot of new signs. So we just cut over the bridge. And we were able to plan this out before we even got into a vehicle. So it was a good time saver too. Like I said, this was a great experience. It really helped me figure out the ins and outs of our company and where we can improve on. And now whenever anybody has questions about it, they come to me and I'm able to give them what they needed. If you have any other questions about how I use my feed, feel free to contact me. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Chelsea. Great job. So at this point, I'd like to know if anyone has any questions for any of our panelists. It's not often that you get an opportunity to speak to a subject matter expert around GTFS, Marcy, or an attorney, Monica, or someone who's been through the process, Chelsea. So I don't see a whole lot of questions in the Q&A. Feel free to add them in or use the chat. That's fine as well. There's one question here for Monica, and that is, can you suggest any legal reasons why a rural transit agency would not agree to the terms of the sample agreement that you just presented?
I don't want to tell any agency what it is that they should or shouldn't do. I think that looking at the agreement and what it asks for and the considerations that we went through, assuming your business goals involve wanting to grow ridership and wanting to promote the service that you have, I can't think of a reason why you wouldn't agree to these terms unless you felt that you couldn't comply with the particular requirements of gathering the data or uploading the data. It doesn't seem to me that the agreement imposes any penalty. There's no penalty provision here where it says if you don't, submit your data on time, then you have to pay $1 million, or if you don't keep your data updated, you get fined. Those things aren't here. However, I would assume that most of you would have a desire to impose, to upload accurate data and keep it updated. And it may be that Google would take a position at some point that they just deactivate your data if it's dead links, right? They may just wipe it off at some point. But again, I think it's a matter for your specific agency to discuss with your counsel and your leadership. But there doesn't seem to be particularly anything onerous about this agreement in terms of financial penalties for non-compliance or anything like that.
Thank you, Monica. We have another question. This is, and I'm not sure, I don't know if you'll have the answer, but we can try. What are your thoughts on agreements between agencies for sharing GTFS data for a regional trip planning tool? Marcy, you can jump in on this one as well.
Marcy, can you?
Oh,
Monica, maybe you could just discuss, if you're sharing the data with one group, is there anything that could get you in trouble or should be thought through when you're sharing it with a regional trip planning tool? Do you see anything there? From our perspective, we're more in Chelsea's camp. We're open data, and we'd like this data to guide that it's accurate in all the different platforms that it may show up. Mobile apps, websites, regional tools, but it is just your schedule in a standardized, digitized way. And that digital format is just standardized. It's as if you were walking into the laundromat and pulling down a copy. It's just a little easier that you don't have to go to every laundromat all over the planet to get the schedule. But Monica, would you have any thoughts on sharing it with a regional planner, and then we'll put this to rest?
Yeah, I mean, I think your data is your data and you can decide to share it with whomever you want. If you have, as you said, you know, you have a trip schedule, you might have a map of your various routes that you distribute to various community partners. I don't see how this is any different simply because it is in this electronic data. Ultimately, it's your information and you can, you know, there's nothing in these agreements that say that you can't. I mean, I guess an interesting question is there's nothing in the Google agreement, for example, that says you're not allowed to share this with Apple or Bing, right? So, and there's nothing in the agreement that says you're not allowed to share it with anyone else either. So I don't see a particular concern there. One of the questions from Wendy is there any legal reason or safety issues that would advise against the general public being able to look at Google Maps and seeing where the bus is? I can't think of anything in particular that is a flag there. I think that people already can access information about where certain bus stops are, and people can already access Google Earth or Google Maps in satellite mode to get certain snapshots of you know, conditions at any particular time. I don't think that anything that happens here makes that any worse. The real time, I don't know what to tell you because I think, Marcy, I don't know what your thoughts are about this. Not an issue of the bus stops, but in terms of the real time, where is my bus? I don't think I know enough about how that works to answer that question.
And that's not our specialty. Our focus really is getting that scheduled data and the agreement so that you're queued up in the future. You'll want to talk with your AVL provider about any legal issues of the buses running late. So thank you for the question, Wendy, because it is one that often comes up. Nancy, do you want to see if there's another question there for Gerardo?
Yeah, so he's asking if there are any liability considerations for transit agencies that rely on providing travel itineraries through Google Transit or other travel planning planners. And again, I think I'm going to throw that one to Monica.
Yeah, I noticed that the agreement with Google, it makes a point of saying that, you know, they're not contemplating that there are any third-party beneficiaries of the agreement, which simply means that, you know, this agreement is made, you know, without consideration of what the various responsibilities are to a third party who might be looking at Google Maps. Having said that, I think if you provide the data and you keep the data current, I can't see that you'd have any liability. Does that answer that question?
I think so. Marcy, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, there is an alert at the bottom of the trip plan itinerary that Chelsea and I, we
right.
do this on occasion. And at the bottom of that agreement from Google or Apple, this data is for planning purposes. You know, we're not liable, you know, we're offering it so that you can plan a trip, but we're not guaranteeing that there won't be a snowstorm or other things that affect whether that trip will happen. So we believe between all of those things that a rider can't come in and sue Google and therefore you that I missed my appointment and therefore I didn't get the job, therefore the rest of my life is ruined. It just won't happen because of those little tiny text that you'll see. We didn't highlight it today, but it is in there. We do have another question, and maybe I'll just summarize it a little bit.
We need to wrap it up pretty soon, Marcy, so
Yeah.
that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, a question about sharing the data through a micro mobility toolkit that's becoming another way of offering riders what they need. Our focus today is really the legal agreements that are between an agency for their fixed route, for their scheduled service. So you'll want to review with your attorney, and we don't see any reason why you can't share the data, but each of those agreements may have wrinkles in there that it's not appropriate for Monica to answer because she hasn't had a chance to do a deep dive and review. It took her a couple of days to really think this through because it is standard terms, but there was some art to think about it as well. So thank you, Monica, and thank you, Chelsea. Thank you, Nancy, for hosting us today. And feel free to reach out to us.
Right. So, and thank you, Marcy. All of you did a great job. So I just want to thank you all for attending today. And we would request that you complete a very brief survey about the webinar. Information you provide in the survey helps us to improve our webinars. It's quick, it should only take a couple of minutes, and the survey will pop up in just a minute. And it's, like I said, it's only a page long. And finally, if you have any questions about trip planning, please email any of us at the email shown on this slide, and we will definitely get back to you. And as mentioned at the beginning of the webinar slides and a recording of the webinar will be posted on our website about a week from today. So the webinar is now ended, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.